And welcome to our April City Club meeting. It promises to be both informative and entertaining. Now, about John Herd Thompson. He's had a distinguished career as a history professor, starting at McGill University in 1971, then moving on to Duke University in North Carolina, of course, in 1989, where 2012, he retired. John is author of numerous books on various aspects of Canadian history, as well as the complicated relationship Canada has with the United States. Perhaps his best-known work is Canada and the United States, Ambivalent Allies, co-authored with Stephen J. Randall. The book is now in its fourth edition and is still very much worth reading. So our format today consists of comments by Professor Thompson, followed by our usual practice of questions from our badge-wearing members. If you aren't a member, but have an overwhelming desire to ask the professor a question, and your neighbor says, "No, you can't borrow my badge," you might want to wander over to our membership desk and join for the modest fee of $35 US or $44.17 Canadian. Now, please join me in welcoming John Herd Thompson to Bellingham City Club.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chuck. It's a great pleasure to be here. You'll learn more about Canada and more about me when I start these slides rolling. This title was actually assigned to me by Chuck. Are we really children of a common mother? Why do Canadians perceive the world so very differently than we here in the United States seem to? And I think it's mostly true. Obviously, Americans don't all see things the same way. Canadians don't either. But you could find a binary between the United States and Canada on certain things. The title Chuck assigned me was so much nicer than the title I had actually thought I was going to use. I sent it to him, and he said, "John, I've got to tell you, I've already told all the members of the club it's going to be hard. We really children." I said, "Let's go with it." My title was Everything That Americans Should Have Learned About Canada in Public School, but probably didn't. Kind of like the NPR show where they say, things you would have learned at school had you been paying attention. So I thank Chuck for giving me that great title. And it's a much better metaphorical hook to hang a talk on than my original one. And I took it seriously, and this is how I get to go forward. I took it seriously, and I thought, But then, of course, I realized that with this slide is designed to make you smile, but also we have to think about the historical context in which the relationship between Canadians and Americans built nation states in the 19th century. And I don't want to make too much of this, but we must remember that the United States profoundly rejected Victoria's grandfather, George III. I tried to figure out what George III's relationship to Elizabeth would be, and it was way too complicated because she came from the German side, and she was actually related to Prince Albert. So I just gave that up. But I want to emphasize that verb rejected. Rejected. That's what the United States, and it's in bold in my text here. There were 4 British colonies north of the 13 colonies that did not embrace the revolutionary experiment against the British Empire. And I'm quite prepared. I don't think there's anybody who's still trying to fight it. There are a few Canadians who are trying to get compensation for property that was seized from their loyalist ancestors in the 1770s, and they've failed thus far. Don't hold your breath if you're worried about that. Cuba, I'd be much more worried about. Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Quebec, which, of course, was a vastly bigger place than the province of Quebec is now. And they chose, and here's another verb, they chose to retain a parliamentary constitution. And in 1867, they chose to confederate to create Canada, and they chose to remain a constitutional monarchy within the British Empire. Britain didn't, and in fact, Britain probably would have been happier in the 1860s if they just said, "We'll get out of your hair." but because the British government had spent a lot of money defending them. Without the British government, there isn't any doubt that a country called Canada wouldn't exist anymore. The United States would, and not because, the theory in Canada is the Americans always wanted to steal our stuff. They wanted to steal our farmland. And if you read a Canadian textbook to this day, they will say that the War of 1812 was because there was rich bottom land up there in Ontario, in Upper Canada, that they could take. In fact, the principal problem with Canada to the founding fathers and the subsequent generations was that it was dangerous to American security. It was a place where lots of very effective fighters of Indian, we'd now call them, in Canada they would call them First Nations, and here we'd call them Native Americans. Dan and I decided that neither of those terms work, so I'm just going to say Indians. There were well-organized Indians who fought like hell to keep the Americans at arm's length, and British North America was a place where they could hide. And until at least the 1830s, they did that. So the founding fathers thought of British North America as a potentially dangerous place, just the way during the Cold War, President Eisenhower thought about Canada as a place, wow, the Soviet Union, the Russians, as we called them, the Russians could attack us from there. So Canada, the big thing about Canada is first security, national security, and it's still an issue now. I don't think I put my slide in. I have a lovely slide. I hope it's in there, but it's not next. It shows an American border guard confronting someone walking through the woods right about here, and he's in an Edmonton Oilers ice hockey jersey, and the border guard says, "Al Qaeda," and he says, "No, Alberta." The decision by the British North Americans not to join the new United States perplexed the founding fathers. It really did perplex them. Thomas Jefferson, he thought that the delegates of Canada would just come to Philadelphia and take the seats that they had ready for them in the Congress. Article 11 of the Articles of Confederation provided British North America with a Get Into America free card. Think about how important that would be now. People want their green cards. And Canada had a collective green card. They all could have been American citizens instead of subjects of his and then her Britannic Majesty. But they decided not to do it. And there's all kinds of reasons why they decided not to do it. There were a lot of, let's face it, I mean, in 1815, Britain was like America is now. If you had a choice between being a British subject and an American citizen, you might think, whoa, if you were cynical, and of course Canadians aren't cynical, they're not. But you could say, wow, I'm not going to do that. Why, as a British subject, I can go anywhere in the British Empire as long as my skin is white. I can go to England and become famous. If I want to go to university, I don't want to go to, well, Duke didn't exist. I don't want to go to Trinity College. I want to go to a real university in Britain and become successful. And Nobel Prizes hadn't been invented, but there was a lot of opportunities. Many Canadians, Nova Scotians, Newfoundlanders even a few Prince Edward Islanders and Ontario, Upper Canadians, went to be educated in Britain and were citizens of a broader British Empire. That was something important, something special. Whatever happened, and of course, one of the wonderful things about being a historian, there's great things about being a historian. 3 quotations equals proof. It's not like being a sociologist where you have to have a whole bunch of machine-readable data. You can use 20/20 hindsight as long as you remember to get your glasses changed when you get to be my age. The most famous American ever to study Canada was a man named Seymour Martin Lipset. Seymour Martin Lipset, who was from New York and trained at Columbia and wrote a number of famous books about Canada and is the most important theoretician about Canada, and the United States. And Seymour Martin Lipset said this was really easy, probably because he didn't want to have to look at all those dusty documents like the Articles of Confederation. And I knew Professor Lipset, and I'm not meaning to diminish his work, far more important than mine. The American Revolution, he said, produced two countries which developed distinct cultures. The United States is the country of the Revolution, and Canada the country of the counter-revolution. I don't believe that, but it's really cool. And if you want to get a B+ in one of my classes, if you can remember all that and make it make sense and produce some supporting evidence, that could be the case. But I think Professor Lipset oversimplifies. The American Revolution was more complicated than that. And of course, it's not as if the revolution ended and everybody said, we're friends now. There's absolutely no reason for us not to get on. Because, of course, there was hostility between Britain's North American colonies and Britain and the United States that lasted at least until the beginning of the 20th century and well past the Civil War. Okay? I lived in the South for many years, and there we call it, I discovered we call it the War of Northern Aggression. But in fact, when I got to Duke University, I told my first class, I introduced myself as a Canadian who had just arrived, and I said, you know, a Canadian, it's sort of like a Yankee, only worse. And a young lady from Charlotte said, sir, there's nothing worse than a Yankee. The American Revolution and its second installment, the War of 1812, and in a sense the War of 1812 to 14 was an extension of the American Revolution. The United States was fighting to be recognized by Britain. Britain would push them around. Britain was seizing American seamen. Okay, it's true, some of them had only been naturalized a few days before, but, well, it wouldn't have mattered because the British Empire did not accept someone's right to become a citizen of a republic. They hated republics. You were a British subject, and these people were seized off American ships. And that was, from the American perspective, the real cause of the War of 1812. Now, in Canadian history textbooks, it's still caused by American aggression and the American desire to seize Canadian farmland and so on, and fisheries, and to take things. But in fact, it was really about proclaiming America as a country, and it was a darn near-run thing. We almost lost that one. What the war did was help create, because national identities are constantly evolving. Many of us think about national identities, and we think a national identity is something that leaps out of the past, like George Washington coming down Mount Vernon with tablets on his arm, and it says, to be an American, you must... There are some Supreme Court justices who believe that's what happens. I mean, if that's the way they did it in 1789, that's the way we should do it now. But national identities are malleable and they change. And the War of 1812 was actually probably the most important moment in the creation of Canadian and American identities. You all recognize Andrew Jackson, one of the many equestrian statues of Jackson, who won the most important battle of the War of 1812, that in effect turned the whole West over to the new republic, the Battle at New Orleans. And the lady over here, you may not know, unless you've eaten some chocolates from the company named after her, which I think is owned by an American company now. But that's a 1993 stamp to Laura Secord, who was a woman who allegedly, in 1813, warned a British garrison about an impending American attack. If you've got really good eyesight, you'll see in Canada, Native American Canadians, First Nations are now celebrated. When I was a little boy in a Canadian school, I learned that was one of the things that made her trip through the woods to warn Lieutenant Fitzgibbons at Beaver Dams that the Americans were coming, one if by land, two if by sea, three to get ready, and four to flee. But these things are still being celebrated. And by the way, we'll come to this later, but the Canadians remember the War of 1812 far more than we do. Until the Civil War, the War of 1812 was the most important American war. And they gave both countries their national anthems. I love the American national anthem. It's a wonderful national anthem because it's not aggressive. The most aggressive national anthem I vote for the French, okay? We'll cover the fields with the blood of foreigners. Yeah, they sing it in French, so you don't know that's what they're really saying. What is the big moment in our national anthem? We saw the flag was still flying. We didn't lose, gosh darn it. It should be the Canadian national anthem. You know, we didn't lose. In the Canadian national anthem, when I was a little boy, all you had to remember was stand on guard, because you did it about 17 times. They changed it a little bit now, and they do something with rights and liberty. I've never learned the new. Since I moved back to Canada, it's awful. I have to sing it in French, because if I say it, I can't remember the new English words. Chuck was so kind to describe me in his publicity as an acknowledged expert on Canadian and American relations. And what he didn't tell you is that the study of the relationship between Canada and the United States, it's a reasonably sized field in the Canadian Academy, and in the American Academy, it's tiny. It's tiny. Being the acknowledged expert in the United States on the relationship between the U.S. and Canada is like being the best bobsledder in Zimbabwe. But I really did teach. I tried to teach, let me see. I actually started going to Duke in 1986. You get old and you forget these details. But, and so until then, I had spent, because I taught US and Canadian history and a little bit of Mexican history, although my accent is very bad. I tried to teach Canadians about the United States, and then I spent the rest of my career trying to teach Americans about Canada. And given that the interest level in Canada was higher about the United States, I had much larger classes in Canada. But the Americans who wanted to learn about Canada approached it the same way that your club approaches things. They were not interested in generating heat. They were interested in light. They really wanted to understand it. I don't know how many of you have good friends who are English Canadians. How many of you have good friends who are English Canadians? Okay. How's their French? Most wonderful thing that happened to me professionally was going to the only school in the United States where you could seriously go and be supported by a full-scale Canadian Studies program. And I never had an American student who didn't learn beautiful French, because they thought that was what they were supposed to do. Whereas in Canada, they would resent it. Open the CBC website any day. Somebody will be complaining, "Oh, those goddamn Frenchies." So I'm a Canadian by birth and an American by naturalization. It was very embarrassing for me, because you get in a room, and I was naturalized. I swear there was one old guy from a country that I can't name, because I don't know which country he was from, who had a USA number, and he was old like I am now. He had a USA #1 cap, and someplace in Eastern Europe, and it was USA #1, and everybody else was Mexican or Canadian. And we were all rushing to naturalize the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, who has a PhD in history, God. The Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, was talking about not allowing people who had been in the United States a long time but hadn't naturalized, not allowing them to collect their Social Security or Medicare when they got old. And of course, this scared us all, so we all rushed in and naturalized. So there we were all waiting there. The Mexicans were dressed up in their charro outfits and everything, and the Canadians were all, had ties and tweed jackets, and we were all getting sworn in. And there's a question, my daughter had the hardest question. They asked her, had she ever lived off the avails of prostitution? But we had to swear, we had to renounce, and it's in the oath, it's still there, we had to renounce all foreign princes and potentates. And I'm sorry, I think it probably included Queen Elizabeth II. And I felt very bad about that. She sent me to college as an officer in her Canadian Navy, so I crossed my fingers and I said, I think it was the year that she said it had been in, no, it was before that year. It wasn't when it went, is it Annus Horribilis, she said? But, so I felt bad about that. You can see that I put up on the slide, I said, we've got some idea in this room, you're sophisticated people from northern Washington, northwestern Washington. So I mean, Canadians, if they saw that I had posted this slide with a picture of my book, would probably say that I was showing off. I was the American side of my character. So instead of putting the 4th edition up there, I just put the 3rd edition up there. I thought that would be a way of demonstrating that I was more modest. Chuck has already told you all this stuff. I taught at McGill University in Montreal, named after this dead capitalist. And then I taught at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, more or less named after this dead capitalist. And I thought, this was a really interesting way to look at some of the things about crossing the border, because they were both of them entrepreneurs who worked in what became Canada, what became the United States. You probably knew that about James McGill. You probably get up in the morning and say, yes, James McGill. He was one of the founders of the Northwest Company, sent the first fur traders out here to the, yeah, for sure. And James Buchanan Duke figured out that the tobacco business was not going to be very successful. And very early on, when an antitrust case damaged his tobacco company, he invested in hydropower, which he used to smelt aluminum. And he did all of that in the Canadian province of Quebec. And that's where most of the fortune that Duke University was built on. And here, by golly, McGill and Duke also played critical roles in the development of the sport of basketball. An example of what we in the biz, because when you're a historian, you don't have a lot of fancy dialogue. I don't know if any of you were in fields where you got fancy dialogue that you could impress people with. Like lawyers have it, and physicians especially have it. But we got a good one here. We call things like this, we call them non-governmental continental subsystems. And basketball is a non-governmental continental subsystem, and it was invented by this man here, Dr. James Naismith from Almonte, Ontario, who was in the McGill class of 1889. And of course, Duke, there's Coach K. I probably don't have to say much about what he contributed to basketball. And I thought to myself, I'll go back, that James Naismith, who was a Canadian who moved to the United States in 1890, his first assignment when he got to the YMCA in Springfield, Massachusetts, it was a rainy winter. He said, you got to invent a game that the boys can play indoors, and it turned out to be basketball. Yeah. And he stayed in the United States he's typical, I think, of, there were hundreds of thousands of Canadians who moved to the United States between 1840 and 1930, when the migration stopped down. Most of them didn't come because they were looking for the freedom that Thomas Jefferson had promised them. They came for economic opportunity. There were just more things to do in the United States. There's a map from Ambivalent Allies. Looks so dated now, those hand-drawn maps. And you can see the migration. And you'll see the number on the bottom. The equivalent of 22% of the Canadian population lived in the United States in our census of 1900. Wow. Every 5th person in North Dakota was a Canadian in 1900. And James Naismith was like that. He went back and forth. They asked him, when he was near the end of his life, they said, what's the greatest basketball team that there's ever been? And he didn't say Duke, and he didn't say Indiana. He said the Edmonton Grads, which was a women's team from Edmonton that won 17 consecutive North American championships. He says they're the greatest. But when he got old, James Naismith, when he got older, for the same reason that many of us naturalized in the 1990s, he naturalized as well. He was concerned about, we were getting pretty nasty in the mid-1920s. You may remember. It wasn't a nice time to be, and not that I thought anybody was probably harassing James Naismith, but in any event, he backed off. So there's a bunch of lessons from these people, this connection between Canadians and the United States. And there's a famous book called The Mingling of the Canadian and American Peoples. But the mingling of the Canadian American peoples is the implication with mingling is that the same number of Canadians mingle down here as the Americans mingle up there. It's not the case at all. In fact, for every American who's moved to Canada, about 10 Canadians have moved to the United States, historically, over time. It's diminished massively, and allegedly, if all these people are to believe, Canada will have a huge influx of population if Mr. Trump wins the Republican nomination and wins the election. But in any event. I thought I'd compare McGill and Duke universities because I think it's a useful way for us to think about things that make Canadians and Americans different. And one of the changes that has taken place is America's not only become very rich, but America's become very stratified, much more stratified than most other countries that we think of as like the United States. We're very, I read the New York Times all the time, sorry about that. The New York Times had a wonderful story about cruise lines, and what they called it, the velvet rope economy. In an age of privilege, not everybody is in the same boat. And it talks about how the 1% can have special things happen to them when they, and you can see the numbers here. The McGill University's total endowment, a paltry 1.48 billion Canadian dollars. Duke's endowment, 7.3 million US dollars. The rankings, and by golly, McGill's giving Quebecers, because in Canada, universities are provincial, and all universities in Canada are more or less public. There are some private universities, but they would be like Bemidji State. I mean, they're not important universities. The highest ranked Canadian university, which is just ahead of Duke, is Toronto, which is number 19, and then Duke is number 20 nationally. You can see that 15 U.S. universities are ranked among the top 25 in the world, and 12 of those are private universities, okay? And Duke has lots of fellowships, by the way, and I taught lots of wonderful undergraduates at Duke. I didn't teach any poor undergraduates at Duke, okay? In any event, I must get to work answering the broad questions that Chuck set out for me. Why and in what ways the United States and Canada diverge politically, socially, and culturally, and why Canadians and Americans perceive the world so differently. I thought of a cheat that I could use if I got to this point and I realized it was getting close to 1 o'clock. I could just put this one up and say, Americans are benevolently ignorant of Canada and Canadians are malevolently well-informed about the United States. And I mostly believe that. I mostly believe that, except I don't know if I believe the well-informed. Because now having lived many years and had people saying, North Carolina, where's that? Is that near Virginia? Two things never to do. Never suggest to a North Carolinian that he or she is from South Carolina, and even worse, don't suggest to a Virginian that he or she is from West Virginia, okay? Wow. And generally, I don't know if you people all know the difference, but in North Carolina, we knew the difference, and most Canadians I encounter have no idea. They've heard of Duke only because basketballia. They don't know about the other two things on our motto, erudito e religio. To Americans, Canada is a matter of consuming disinterest, and you were just putting the lie to that, more than 200 of you showing up. Americans don't think that there's much to know about Canada, and they mostly don't care to know it. Canadians, on the other hand, are completely preoccupied with the United States of America, obsessed with America, as it were, and they imagine incorrectly that they already know everything there is to know about the United States. Through the miracle of Dr. Google, I was able to find it's an outfit called Quora, the best answer to any question. I don't know how many of you have used it. And I found that they had just asked 2 questions that would give me some data about stereotypes that Americans hold of Canada and stereotypes that Canadians hold of the United States. And the N for American participants was 23. The N for Canadian participants was 40. So that's about right. I mean, that means probably about 10 times as many Canadians were interested in the question than Americans. And the American questions are just, Canadians would say, that's what they would say, isn't it? Everyone is white. Canadians are very polite. Best neighbors one could imagine. Don't go to Costco on the weekend. I see Canada as a vast, unspoiled place. There's no crime in Canada. There are polar bears everywhere. The N equals 40, what do Canadians think of Americans, was pretty gentle. Not the kind of thing that I encountered in a bar in Westminster when I cheered for the United States soccer team during the most recent World Cup. They were playing the Nigerians. Actually, it was one World Cup in any event. They're playing the Nigerians, and I'm cheering for the United States, and everyone else is sitting at the bar. They're all looking at me funny, except for one guy named Harvey, who it turned out was an American too. And they said, why was I cheering for the United States? And I said, well, because I'm an American. And they're Canada's neighbors and everything, and they said, they were all cheering for the Nigerians. Nigeria. Yeah, I mean, yeah, no more needed to be said. A wide gamut of adjectives about Americans appeared in these entries. One of my favorite cartoons. You seem familiar yet somehow strange. Are you by any chance Canadian? It's from the New Yorker. One of the things that happens is in the middle of the 1990s, the Canadian Football League expanded to the United States and created 4 franchises in the United States. And this is that's of course the Toronto Globe and Mail, which is supposed to be Canada's paper of record. It's the New York Times of Canada for English-speaking people. And these are people cheering for the fans of the Baltimore Stallions, who won the Canadian Football Championship year. And here they are here, and a wide gamut of adjectives about Americans in these things that I read. The common ones: rude, overweight, ethnocentric, and clueless about anything non-American, racist, overly nationalistic, greedy, arrogant, and warmongering. So from my collection of literally thousands of Canadian anti-American cartoons and my collection of I didn't choose any from my collection of 7 or 8 American cartoons that I found. Here's the stereotype. You can see we know what the stereotype is. And this is quite nasty. It's supposed to overly nationalistic, greedy, arrogant, and warmongering. This is a cartoon from another Canadian newspaper of considerable significance. It's called the Toronto Star, and it talks about America's arms sales to the world and how America is warmongering, racist, overly nationalistic. The one thing that I did find, and I would have been disappointed I haven't found it in these 40 entries from Canadians talking about Americans, we kicked American butt in something called the War of 1812. And Canada, of course, has just gone through an orgy of commemorating the War of 1812. Prime Minister Harper spent a lot of money on this project. And given that it was mostly Native American Canadians, First Nations Canadians, and British regular troops who, when they occasionally did so, kicked American butt, and Canada really didn't exist. It's interesting how excited they came about it. The same event, our flag was still flying. At the same time, British regulars landed and marched to Washington, and they burned the Capitol. It wasn't very nice. And that, I think, qualifies as kick. And so Canadians love to tell you, we burned the White House. And I said, you haven't even seen the White House, let alone having burned it. You can't get near it. You couldn't burn the White House. Now there's fences and easily observable structural differences between Canada and the United States, and then I'll get out of it. The most easily observable structural difference is that over its history, Canada has been more inclined to accept an enhanced role for the state than the United States. Okay? Not because Canadians are crypto, though some Americans think this, not many. Not because Canadians are crypto-communists or collectivists, but because Canada is a big country stretched with a small population over a large area, and it's right next to the United States. And so when Canada has created public responses to what are perceived as public policy problems, it's usually for one of those two reasons. The example I was going to offer you was that since 1932, Canada has had a tax-supported national broadcasting system, which CBC, Société de Canada, which operates in English, French, and several indigenous languages. And the justification for its creation was that if Canada didn't do this, ABC, NBC, and CBS would come to Canada, and they'd control Canadian broadcasting. And the slogan to create this, here's a slogan: give me liberty or give me death, give me public broadcasting. The state or the United States was the slogan. Canada, of course, also has a national single-payer healthcare system, which Americans are interested in, and I'll be happy to talk about it. It's confusing because Canadians who speak English universally call it Medicare. And as a double dipper, I get to participate in Medicare, but if I have a wreck today, believe me, I'm going to pull out my real Medicare card when I go to the hospital. The system was originated in the province of Saskatchewan by a government of the New Democratic Party in 1962 and became national in stages after 1966. And I'll use that to make my last point, which is that Canada's political system is both structurally different and functionally different than the United States. Both countries use the first-past-the-post system. Well, we mostly use the first-past-the-post system. The primary system seems to be confusing some of the people who are trying to go through it. Mr. Saunders says that he won Washington, by golly, but I don't know how many people voted in the caucuses. Mr. Trump thinks he's getting cheated, or is it Mr. Cruz thinks he's, because it's not all first past the post. But the first past the post system in the Canadian party system, which at the present has 5 parties represented in the Federal House of Commons, the first past the post system produces results that would amaze Americans. I mean, the last serious third party we had in this country, I would say, is the populists from the late 1880s and the 1890s. And I don't know, what was the guy with the funny haircut who helped Mr. Clinton? Ross Perot, thank you very much. I don't know if we can make that serious. An amazing thing has happened. The United States is paying a lot of attention to this young man here who's 44 years old, quite handsome. He wears brown shoes with a blue suit, which I had a friend who was a sex worker, and she said the way to tell cops was if they wore brown shoes with blue suits. But never mind. Justin Trudeau was hailed for his landslide victory. Whoa! And he does have a landslide victory in the sense that his party holds 188 of the seats in the House of Commons, far more than half. But they won it with 30, I can't, my number's too small, 39.47. What would we call someone in the United States who in a presidential election won 39 point, we would call him George. We would call him George McGovern. We would call him George McGovern. So and I think that's the end. Oh, no, I wanted to show this one. This just in, and it really, literally is just this in. It came from a lady that I know, a Canadian, and she sent me this just as I was putting this slideshow together. And how it feels as a Canadian watching U.S. politics right now, and it shows a burning car across the street from a mother moose with her 2 little, what are they, calves? Moose calves. 2 little moosettes there, and she said, and how it feels as a Canadian watching U.S. politics, and I was offended. I thought, oh, when you're a Canadian, you're not responsible for anything. You can just wander around and say, no, it was the Americans did that, so I can get out of that. But when you're an American, it's like you're carrying the United States in your backpack. People in other countries think that you're responsible for, and I get emails saying, it's not just Mr. Trump who upsets me. It's the fact that he's so universally supported among Americans, which just proves that they're racist. And I want to say, well, wait a minute. 75% of American women say they would never vote for him. And women are a majority of the population, so wouldn't that... But, yeah. So the American side of me was kind of offended by this, but I couldn't resist showing it to you today. Thank you very much. And I'm...
Okay, thank you very much, John. Now it's time for our usual questions, or the opportunity for questions. Don will work this side of the room, so if you have an interest in asking a question, raise your hand. And Jane is over here.
What was the influx of folks from the United States during the Vietnam era into Canada?
Substantial.
Yeah.
substantial.
Do you have any numbers?
More than 100,000, allegedly, but it's difficult to be exactly. We did Canada an enormous favor. I mean, university presidents, doctors, lawyers, lots of people, and many of them have stayed in Canada. Some didn't. Some returned home. Of course, Jimmy Carter created an amnesty and people went back. There's a couple of interesting books. They tend to be anecdotal. No one has done a systematic study. They've been just like historians. I mean, 3 quotations equals proof. They were, we called them, one of the interesting things about Canada is when something controversial happens in North America, some Canadians adopt one American position, some adopt another American position, and some adopt a third American position. And polls, until late in the war, when it got really nasty, until Walter Cronkite turned against the war, a third of Canadians thought, we got to stand up to those communists. A third of Canadians thought, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is gonna win. And the ones in the middle weren't sure what to think, and they were the ones who moved over. So in effect, and there were all of these interesting people who did some weird things. My first TA at McGill University in Montreal became involved in a relationship with an African-American deserter from the United States Marines. And she started having sex with him in my office in the Stephen Leacock building. And her Canadian husband became very upset about this, and it caused no end of grief, and I felt completely not responsible for any of this. So it was complex. There's a wonderful singer who was among them, a Southerner named Jesse Winchester. I don't know if any know Jesse Winchester. He wrote a wonderful song called Yankee Lady, about a lady who was on the Underground Railroad and helped him get through Vermont to Quebec. And then he wrote another one called Snow. I was tuning in the 6 o'clock newscast when the weatherman mentioned snow. As soon as I heard that 4-letter word, I made up my mind to go. And Jesse went back to the United States when the amnesty came. It's estimated some Canadians came to the United States to volunteer to fight in Vietnam. The number that's usually cited is about 6,000, and the problem with that is everybody who was a Canadian citizen at any time in his life, my passport is still stamped born in Canada, who was in the service and was in the service during the Vietnam War is considered to be in the Vietnam War. So there's no way that we can disaggregate them. And I don't know what the answer is.
Hello. Hi. I'm a proponent of single payer. I think it's awesome. I hope we get that here someday. And when I talk about that to my friends, everyone knows a Canadian who had to wait like 3 years for a hip replacement or something. And they say, oh, everyone up there supplements with private insurance. It's not that great, blah, blah, blah. What is really the truth?
Well, of course, the truth that I have is the truth that I have because it's the truth that I've experienced. And my experience has been that the healthcare, and I've been back in British Columbia. I think I got my British Columbia MSP card sometime either in the late fall of 2013 or the early spring of, because there's a 3-month waiting period, but because I had been born in Canada, I was eligible for it. My experience is as follows. I pay $75 a month because I only keep Medicare Part A, so I don't pay anything for that. I would say that the health care I'm receiving in British Columbia is pretty much the same as the health care I'm receiving at Duke, except it's a lot less. I received at Duke, which was, of course, I think it was number 6 at America's hospitals. We're number 6. And you could get your things done more quickly, probably, but it never became an issue for me in either place. I'm an epileptic. And as soon as I checked in, I got a physician, lives just down Columbia Street from me. And he said, oh, well, we got to get this checked out. And I had an appointment almost immediately with a neurologist who gave me a sleep-deprived EEG and said, nope, you got to keep taking that Kipper for the rest of your life, John. Actually, he didn't talk like that. He was much more sophisticated. I shouldn't be putting that Canadian accent on. Then I had what in North Carolina we call a big old hernia. And when it got really big old, and my doctor said, that's a pretty big hernia, John, we got to fix that. That would have been in May. I saw the surgeon in the first week of June. She said, whoa, that's a big hernia. I wasn't officially scheduled. I was put on her waiting list. And I got in on the 25th of July. So that was it's a little more than 2 months. So, and in Duke, I don't know what it would have been. It's free. It really is free. You pay your $75, and people complain. $75, and I said, well, if I were on Medicare Part B, I'd be paying $130, and I'd be paying co-pays for everything. One of the most wonderful words I've ever heard Canadians say: "What's a co-pay?" What's a co-pay? When I tell them,
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. We have another question?
Thank you. From the Canadian experience, what would you advise us to do in this country to be more welcoming to Syrian refugees?
a very good question. And of course, historically, the Canadian response to refugees and the American response to refugees has been pretty much the same, not very welcoming. If we look at the response to Jewish refugees from fascist Europe, the Canadians were a little harder. The Canadian the deputy minister responsible for that said, they asked him how many Jews Canada was going to accept. He said, none is too many. Okay? Canada started to get to be good on refugees when there were lots of white refugees to take, and who were Christians. So the first big refugee acceptance in Canada was the Hungarians in 1956. And I don't exactly remember how many Canadians took, but like the war resistors, draft dodgers, I mean, there were many, and lots of famous Canadians were Hungarian refugees, and that started a sort of a tradition. Canadians, like every other country, reinvent their history and pick the things that they like, okay? And they like this. Canadians like to say, we invented the United Nations Peace Force, yes, sir. Yes, sir, in the Sinai. Lester Pearson, and I thank Prime Minister Pearson, okay? When Lyndon Johnson, a man I also admire, when Lyndon Johnson wanted to send literally me and my comrades to Vietnam, he said, we could sure use 3 ships from the Canadian Navy. How about Saskatchewan, which I was a member of the ship's company? And I didn't know about this till I was a historian, and I looked this up. And Mr. Pearson said, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. We can't do that, Mr. Johnson. And so I admire Lester Pearson, and Lester Pearson did fine things. But the reason that Canada created the peace forces was because President Eisenhower wanted Canada to create the peace force. They wanted to find a way, because you may remember an Israeli, French, and British force had captured the Suez Canal, humiliated Egypt, which President Eisenhower, for better word, thought was not a good idea for world peace, and so the Canadians went to buffer these two, and Canada participated in a number of peace forces. So Canada, I'm not answering your question, but I will. You want to remember the things you do well. Canada got in on the ground floor with Syrian refugee accepting. It was fascinating to me to watch, because young Mr. Trudeau, I better go back to Mr. Trudeau now. Young Mr. Trudeau went to the airport and met the first refugee family to come to Toronto. And I thought, how come they all have Armenian names? Because, of course, hundreds of thousands of Armenians, when the Turks started murdering Armenians, moved to Syria. And I don't know if it was embarrassing or nobody in Canada knew what's Syrians. Yeah, they're Syrians. None of the women were wearing headscarves. They were so excited to be in Canada in time for Christmas. I'm celebrating Christmas with my family. So Canada got on the ground really fast, and these were the people who wanted to come. And so if the United States could be guaranteed that they would all be Armenians who were Christians, we'd probably be more receptive of them. I don't want us to beat ourselves up about this. We should be more receptive, but gosh darn it, with the complete logjam that we have because of our political system, I think most Americans, we know from polling data, we know that most Americans are sympathetic to the plight of the refugees. And we should get in there early while there's still lots of interesting families to bring. But of course, lots of Muslim families from Syria they've stayed this long, they want to stay. Mr. Obama, I think, did a wonderful, he told the Europeans that it's time we got to get on this, and we've got to do more for the people who are fleeing across the Mediterranean.
Another question here?
To go from the refugees from the refugees to the Native Americans, would you like to compare the difference in how our government treats our natives?
I think both countries have a lot to be ashamed about. It's interesting that one of the things, and this goes back to the end of the 19th century, one of the things that Canadians liked that made them feel good about themselves was that they were nicer to, I'm going to use the word Indians because that's what people call them, they were nicer to Indians than the Americans were. You could make a case that that's true. Canada, of course, did inherit the British tradition of trying not to integrate, but at least to be somewhat fair to the Aboriginal peoples that they conquered. And Canada inherited that. At the time that the United States had its worst Indian wars on the plains, Canada was in the process of signing treaties in federally controlled, where the land was federally controlled, like Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories. But over time, I'm not sure that Canada's still ahead of us on that. They seem to be racing to odium. In Canada, reservations are called reserves, and there have been, if any of you follow Canadian news, there's a crisis of young people attempting suicide on northern reserves, and nobody seems to know what to do. Dan and I were talking about this because Dan spent most of his career working with the Lummi, and I think we agreed it was intractable, that it was difficult, and it was really hard to choose one nation's. When I taught this, I taught a class called the North American Wests, and it was about Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And the three countries have a different approach to it. And in Canada, in Canada, Mexicans are called Mexicans, and they need visas. In Canada, Indians are called First Nations. And so Canada has invented this fiction that this is comparable to a nation state, which of course that wasn't really even invented when most of the Amerindians got established. And Mr. Trudeau says we're going to talk to them on a nation-to-nation basis. And I thought, oh boy, there's a dog's breakfast. But Canadians have this idea, this sort of multicultural mosaic. That's their conception of their country. Our country, we have the concept of, gosh darn it, everybody's an American. I don't like the term melting pot, but everybody's supposed to be part of the United States. And of course, in Mexico, they have this wonderful idea, which is also just an idea. They talk about Mexico profundo. Everybody is a Mexican, and it goes all, and then it turns out the Aztecs were Mexican, and so we're all descended from the Aztecs. Wow. And of course, if you go to the three countries, you see that the indios that I see when I'm wintering in Barata are mostly indios who are selling things to turistas on the playas. And lighter-skinned people are doing all the important jobs, and really lighter-skinned people are doing all the really important jobs. In the United States, I actually think in the United States it may be that individual Native peoples can get ahead a little more easily than they can in the United States. But in Canada, there's lots of, I don't know how many of them were elected with young Mr. Trudeau, but for the first time, Native peoples really started to participate in the Canadian electoral process. In Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Alberta, Native people who either hadn't voted or had always voted for the New Democratic Party voted for Mr. Trudeau's party this time. A number of talented parliamentarians were defeated. So maybe something exciting will happen. The Minister of Justice is descended from, has Amerindian background, and maybe she'll be able to do something. Not a real good answer, I'm sorry.
You have a question here?
I'm wondering if you have any insights into the trade agreements that we have between Canada and the United States.
Well, I think they've been beneficial for both countries. I mean, the fact is that it's something that's become much more and are publicly debated. And most of my colleagues who practice the dismal science of economics say that as long as we make efforts to look after people who are supplanted when what they do is transferred somewhere else, that the benefits of free trade will be more significant for everybody. The problem in the United States is, unlike Canada, because Canada, of course, has a better social safety net. So the people who were displaced when manufacturing moved, and it didn't usually move from Canada to the United States, because we have to consider Mexico as part of this. When Canadian companies moved to Mexico, Canadian workers were better looked after than American workers were looked after. And so we haven't played fair as Americans. We haven't played fair with people who were displaced by the trade agreements. And it's something that nobody can dodge, although, Mr. Trump's going to... Isn't this interesting? Mr. Trump has not mentioned Canada. Anybody follow him in detail? I don't believe he's mentioned Canada at all. And yet Canada made out like a bandit and stole it. You know, I'm being silly, but... and he's not going to build a wall with Canada? I think it's a conspiracy. But... Mr. Sanders has clearly got a lot of momentum from his arguments about trade. So it's an issue that Americans will have to talk about. To discuss it sensibly is harder, though, because the argument is obviously if we didn't trade, America doesn't depend on trade as much as Canada and Mexico do. And of course, the first big trade agreement was the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, and then the Mexicans joined in '92. And it hasn't ravaged the American economy.
Absent any questions, it is time then for us to end our time together by thanking John for his presentation. You did a nice job. Thank you very much.